One live.
Hello, welcome to this panel on the link between private security, human rights, and COVID-19. We're very happy to have you here. So I am Gabrielle Priklopilova. I work for the Business and Security Division of the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance. And I'm very happy to be here with very distinguished experts. So what we're going to ask here is why is unregulated provision of private security a risk for human rights, in particular in times of COVID-19? So, and the idea is to look at those risks for human rights also for vulnerable groups in times of COVID-19, and for vulnerable groups such as migrants and women and LGBT communities. The private security provision can be a very can be very risky and impact them negatively. It can, I'm being very bleak here, it can also be positive if well regulated, but so that we are going to point out more here what are the risks and how we can manage them and how we can prevent them. So the idea here is to gather lessons on how we can mitigate these risks and amplify private security's positive role in fighting a global pandemic such as COVID-19. So as I said, we have top-notch experts here to help us to unpack these issues. But first, what I want to tell you is that we would like you to participate in this session. So please look at the slide that should be on right now. You can see how to participate. You have there is a link that you can follow. There's a QR code. So you just put your phone on the QR code and it will take you directly to our channel, and do select channel 4. So it's the yellow channel. You can also include the code if you're not comfortable with QR codes. Most of us are getting used to all this. You can just type in hashtag FRF 2021. Okay, so this is for you, and we really need you to participate, to ask questions, to challenge us, and to make this conversation the most lively as possible. So we have a lot to unpack today, and I'm going to introduce our panelists that will help us to understand this very complicated issue of private security, human rights, and COVID-19. So we have here Dr. Sorcha MacLeod, who is a Marie Curie Fellow, an Associate Professor in the Center for Private Governance, CEPRI, in the Faculty of Law, University of Copenhagen, and she's also a member of the UN Working Group on Mercenaries. We have Daria Davitti. Daria is Associate Professor in Public International Law at Lund University, Faculty of Law. And we have also Beatrice Godefroy, Europe Director at the Center for Civilians in Conflict. So this is CIVIC. So as you can see, I was not lying. We have distinguished experts here. And we want to mention that there is a poll, and we would be very grateful if those listening to us could answer the question on the poll on Slido. The slide is still there. You can still see how to access the platform for you to comment. So let's get started. Shall we? So we have let's start by trying to understand what is the human rights impacts of private security. So Sorcha, can I ask you to tell us a little bit, what is the issue with private security and human rights in general, and then maybe Daria, you could tell us a bit why COVID-19 is particularly problematic for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabby. Well, one of the things that we've seen with private security during the pandemic is that private security companies have been hired more and more by governments, but also by other actors. And so we are seeing private security companies operating in a whole lot of new and different spaces. And this has had a very direct and significant impact on human rights. So, for example, we're seeing that states and organizations like the European Union, for example, are using emergency legislation, which is allowing them to contract with and to outsource to private security companies. And when they're doing that, they are circumventing some of the traditional limitations or some of the traditional oversight of private security companies. So that means that things like training and management of these companies has been very different during the pandemic. And so we're also seeing them moving into new spaces, as I said. So they've been moving into providing security for medical sites, but also for things like COVID testing sites, vaccination sites. They have been guarding quarantine facilities, so quarantine hotels, and they've been impacting on people whose movement has been limited. So we're also seeing that in relation to incarcerated people, so people who've been detained either in prisons or in migrant detention facilities. And so we're seeing that private security companies have the opportunity to impact on human rights in a whole variety of different ways. And what has happened is that some of the existing challenges that we already saw with private security and human rights issues, it's not that they've suddenly reappeared, it's that they've been exacerbated. It's not that these problems didn't exist, they're being exacerbated, they're being made worse because of the reduction in oversight, because security guards aren't necessarily being trained properly, because the oversight mechanisms are not in place in the same way. Now, the oversight mechanisms were always problematic. So all we're seeing is a shift in the impacts. I think Daria is going to talk about this in a second, but we've seen particularly that marginalised groups have experienced particular human rights impacts as a result of private security being contracted during the pandemic. So that could be migrants, asylum seekers, people who are detained or incarcerated, as I've already mentioned. But things like COVID curfews also impact on the poorest, people who are racialized, people who are homeless, or the LGBTI plus community. So people being who experience human rights impacts in a particular way, they're experiencing those human rights impacts in a worse way because they're encountering private security, which doesn't have the same sort of oversight as perhaps public security forces do.
Thank you so much, Stasia, for this this very interesting overview of the impact of private security on human rights. Daria, do you have the same opinion that it's just an exacerbation, or do we see new forms of human rights violations? And as from your background, you work a lot on migrant groups, etc. Can you tell us a little bit why it's really concerning for them, this lack of regulation of private security? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Gabby. Yes. So I can certainly, so from my research, which focuses mainly on people on the move, so refugees and migrants, and also internally displaced, what we have seen, as Sorcha has clearly given us a picture of, what we have seen is an exacerbation, but also an acceleration of the adverse impact for vulnerable groups, and in particular people on the move. Because what we saw before the pandemic was already the rising of a presence of private security contractors in border control, okay, so and in migration control measure and policy. So already we saw a distancing of the state through the use of private military and security companies or service contractors more generally. And so what we saw, it's for instance a use of data gathering and on what have become known as digital borders. And so what we see with the pandemic, what we have seen with the pandemic has been really an impact at the intersection between the pandemic and the digital border. So really how the two have merged and have overlapped to create an acceleration of adverse impact. In particular, just to give you some example, Sorka has already mentioned migrant detention. The use of migrant detention has become more intense because, of course, the idea was to contain the spread of the virus. And so for containing the spread of the virus, so increasingly states have chosen to limit the movement of migrants, also in those detention centers that maybe were open and would have allowed movement. But also at the same time, we have seen private contractors more involved in return and expulsion, but also in the processing of data. And so the retention of those data, how the processing of those data has been taking place, of course, has raised multiple concerns. And more generally, more broadly, is also we need to consider, like Sorka mentioned, issues of intersectionality and how particular groups could be affected differently within the migration and refugee groups. So in particular, if you think of women and children and LGBT community, but also more generally issues of inequalities in relation to access to vaccines and how access to vaccines really have become secondary in terms of importance when it comes to the non-citizens, right? And really this initial, at least, misunderstanding that of course everybody needs to be vaccinated because we're not going to be completely protected unless everybody has access to the vaccine and has access to the same level of protection. So as I said, as Sorka also mentioned, an exacerbation but also an acceleration of the impacts, and in some ways also the impacts bifurcating and becoming a lot more complicated and perhaps more difficult to tackle.
Thank you very much for these insights, which are a little bit concerning. Now, could I move to Beatrice? Maybe could you work with you focus more on civilian populations in conflict countries. So could you tell us a little bit from your perspective what are the risks of COVID-19 and security service providers?
Yeah, thank you very much, Gabby, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this panel with my distinguished co-panelists. Yeah, maybe I will bring a more nuanced perspective. It's true that civics research on the protection of civilians and COVID has been looking at the impact of the COVID-19 on the physical protection of civilian populations in conflict countries, meaning with a focus on the physical security and the threats posed by local and international security forces. But having said that, a number of threats and issues that we found in this research point at, I think, let's say, are relevant as well to other security providers, including private security and military companies. So, and just maybe a caveat before speaking. So I'm the Europe Director of CIVIC. I'm also a board member of the International Code of Conduct Association for Private Security Providers, but I'm speaking here indeed in my quality of Europe Director at CIVIC. So in terms of the more nuanced view, what our research found was that the pandemic has had a universal, global impact, let's say, on civilian populations in conflict, but at the same time, it has not been universal. So the impact on civilian population has changed depending on the variability of the variable intensity of the restrictive measures, as well as, of course, the very context linked to the conflict itself. This led to a situation, for instance, in some countries in the very early stage of the pandemic response, there were high levels of violence reported by Iraqi security forces or Nigeria security forces, for instance. But in other contexts, like in Afghanistan or Ukraine, we didn't, these countries did not experience a significant increase in the level of civilian harm as a result of COVID. So I think having in mind this different or let's say this variety of situations depending on the context is also an interesting point. Another element to nuance that that impact on civilians was the fact that indeed local security forces have been brought in the early days of the pandemic to be there as frontline responders and to support the enforcement of lockdowns and restrictive measures in addition to their usual tasks. And we had local security forces being operating under intense pressure and fatigue, lacking personal protective equipment, not having received training on public health responses or basic protection of civilian trainings, because of course protection of civilians trainings are rare, and they are when they exist, they are devoted to other units within security and defense forces. And overall, they also lacked procedures and legal frameworks. So we ended up in situations where in many contexts, states fell back on emergency legislation to mobilize the local security forces to be part of the pandemic response. And using this expanded power created indeed new risk of civilian harm that I think Daria and Sorka very well explained. So having said that, again, as our research went through and looking at specifically conflict countries, we indeed have noticed in a number of countries very significant threats to civilians, including the use of lethal force and a wide array of violations that have been listed earlier. I think one context was particularly striking in the very early days of the COVID response in South Africa, when they had put in place their first 21-day lockdown. Data show that within the first 5 days of this lockdown, the police had reportedly killed 3 people, and at that time, that were more people than had been effectively that had effectively died from COVID-19. So there was this balance between the threat and the violence endured as a result of restrictive measures versus the threat that the pandemic itself was posing to populations. I would just also very much like to reinforce one of the messages that of Sorka and Daria, that is very clearly that vulnerable communities were at much higher risk of harm at the hands of security forces enforcing COVID-19 measures than other groups. And that was the case indeed for sexual minorities, sex workers, as well as women and girls. So maybe my last comment, because I think also it points out potentially specific threats that can come from security providers. We have seen indeed an aggravation of existing protection threats. So there were new protection threats arising from the use of local security and defense forces in enforcing, in policing functions and enforcing lockdowns and public health measures, but there were aggravation of existing trends. And our report that will come out actually in November lists a number of these threats, but what's also interesting to our conversation in the fact that usually in conflict countries you would have international missions, either doing security force assistance, peacekeeping, monitoring, that are there to indeed monitor and provide also a first element of response and prevention to incidents of civilian harm. And it's still preliminary findings, and they need to be much more investigated and triangulated. But what we found through interviews was the fact that while international missions were affected by the difficulty to rotate staff, and that themselves faced in some situations a lack of access due to movement restrictions, the capacity to monitor incidents of civilian harm and violations were also reduced. Or in some instances, they were not reduced, but they were a perception that they were reduced, therefore creating vis-a-vis some actors and some potential perpetrators a sentiment, an idea of relative impunity or sense of impunity, which wasn't actually confirmed by the facts, because a number of the monitoring missions could actually continue to operate. So I'll stop here, but again, very much agree with the typology of threats that were and abuses and violations that were mentioned, nuancing it in conflict countries by context, because we have seen a diversity of situations. And overall, according to the ACLED data, the global amounts of the global levels of violence against civilians between 2019 and 2020 in conflict countries was overall the same. Over to you, Gabby.
Thank you very much for this interesting nuance. So I hear from all of you here that we're facing a very bleak picture, and we see risks that are aggravated in conflict contexts and in for vulnerable populations. So I'm just going to try something and see if there's any way we can try and have a positive outlook. This is a difficult question, you know, because what I wanted to ask you is when we see this aggravation of human rights risks due to private security provision, can we actually find a way of spinning it positively and saying what could, you know, how could private security what kind of role could they play positively in a situation like this? But I know it's very hard because at the moment we see quite a lot of suffering and a lot of human rights adverse human rights impacts. But maybe we can think about you know, what they could be doing that could actually increase our security. I could start by saying that, for example, they were able to complement public security forces in enforcing COVID-19 social distancing measures. So that means that basically police could concentrate on other topics and leave that type of task to private security. But as Sorcha and Daria and Beatrice were saying, it led more to more aggravation in human rights. But could we imagine maybe that if private security were adequately regulated and trained, they would be able to actually show us a new be a potential force for more protection? So Sorcha, would you mind trying to tackle this somehow?
Thank you, Gabby, or not. I think one of the things that Beatrice mentioned that I think we could perhaps spin it in a positive light, and that is the issue around the security guards themselves. Because it's definitely been very clear, and obviously Beatrice has been talking about conflict situations, but one of the things that definitely has come out of the last 18 months or so is that the security industry is very often an industry that we know it's not well regulated. We know that the vetting and training procedures are not necessarily tremendously effective. We know that that during the pandemic, the private security guards were not being given proper protective equipment, PPE equipment, and in fact in the UK, the National Statistics Office showed that private security guards had some of the highest mortality rates of any profession outside of the medical professions in terms of contracting COVID, and of course that's because they're working with, so if you've got people who have been incarcerated or people who've been detained, whatever the circumstances, who are not able to isolate, who are not able to socially distance, if you haven't got appropriate PPE for the people who are tasked with guarding these people, then of course the workers are also at risk. So if we can take one positive thing out of the pandemic, I think it's that it's been able to shine a light on the some of the really poor labour standards that we see in the industry, and hopefully this is something that we would see improving, that we would see better pay, better conditions, better equipment for the workers. And I think, as a general point, I think anything that shines a light on the industry and on the human rights problems that the industry faces, I think has to be a good thing. There is a perception, that about private security that is, that it's highly professionalized, that it's highly, everybody has uniforms, maybe has weapons, but actually that's not necessarily the case. And I think states really need to take seriously the issue of regulation of this sector. And hopefully that's something that would come out of the pandemic.
Thank you, Sophia. And Daria, do I dare turn to you to ask you as well, because you talk about vulnerable groups, can you imagine a world where we could foster the strength of the private security industry to actually increase the level of protection?
Yeah, no, this is a fundamental question, and this is an important question that we need to try and address. So if there was a magic wand and I could just wave it, of course, so I would think of the words of the Human Rights Commissioner for Refugees and the joint statement with the Human Rights Commissioner for Human Rights. And they called back in March 2020, when the pandemic became and was acknowledged as a pandemic, that there was a need for trust, transparency, respect, and empathy for the most vulnerable. So I think there is a role for private security to contribute to that empathy for the vulnerable groups in our community, for the most vulnerable group in our community. So we could imagine them facilitating vaccine access for people on the move. We could imagine them enhancing detention conditions, But the precondition, like Sorka said, need to be there. And the preconditions cannot, as we all know, materialize in moments of crisis. In moments of crisis is when we need to be ready and prepared. So in an ideal world, so what we need to learn, so if we can learn something from this is that, yes, there is a need for better regulation and there is a need for better vetting and a preparedness for what we know are going to be the next challenges, no? So, I mean, we all are expecting the next challenges ahead. So really, there is a role, I think, for the private sector, but states also, if we consider the specific case of people on the move, states should not be seen, and also international organizations should not be seeing the private sector as an excuse to outsource and distance themselves from responsibility, but should see them as partner in trying to engender really this empathy and this different world, if we want to imagine it. It's not going to happen on its own, I don't think. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done together jointly there.
So that's a very interesting point. Beatrice, did you want to add something before we have a question from our chat? But did you want to jump in quickly before we go to the question from the audience?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Gabby. And I guess the point I wanted to make is, I think your question whether the private security companies can be, let's say, a factor for an actor of good, a factor for good here. I think it comes back to what in general we're expecting also from security forces. We are expecting that, or what we're seeing is that there can be a threat in the way they conduct their own operations and activities. But of course, if these activities are being done in a way that integrates civilian harm mitigation, then there are an opportunity for better protection. And I think the same could apply to private security providers in these very complex environments. What we have seen, for instance, also in Afghanistan or Ukraine, for instance, was indeed good examples of national security forces not being accused of abuses, while on the other hand, being a driver for better security during, for instance, when they were responding to riots against lockdown, for instance. Likewise, in Ukraine, we've seen the armed forces of Ukraine as deployed along the contact lines in Donbass that actually try to work on their dialogues with civilians in order to be able to address specific protection threats. So again, this is not, you can't do a copy paste to the private security sector, but I think the bottom line here is that it's indeed, the question is what type of task do you perform or do you undertake, but also how do you undertake them? And therefore, indeed, what type of training, SOPs, guidance and frameworks do you have in place? As well as how do you simply undertake this task with a priority put on your role as a protector, which is a new role for private security providers to undertake. And there would be many recommendations indeed to be done to member states in terms of how they frame better this work, in terms of how they are better prepared, but also to clients in case, obviously, the clients are not only states. So lots of, I think, of good practices that we could try and document from how local security forces, with the support of service providers, I believe managed in a number of instances to increase the level of protection or the level of security, as opposed to decreasing it. Hoping to bring in the most positive side that you were looking for, Gabby.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Yes. So, and I would also, if I may add, as well, add the fact that in some countries, of course, the public security forces don't have a very good reputation, and you do notice that private security providers benefit from much more trust and are felt to contribute much more to security than public security forces. So that can happen as well. So we have I would say, somewhat controversial question, so I hope you are ready, ladies. But this is a strong panel, so I'm sure we can make it. So one question we got was, would the panelists go as far as to say that there must be no private security at all? I know that you've all answered that question somehow, because you all mentioned that, in what way it could be positive, and you did make the effort to think about how to increase citizens' protection by private security providers. And then another one that you also somewhat answered was, what are some good practices that governments could follow? So who wants to take this one first? Sorcha.
Well, that wasn't a choice, was it? So I think, the first question, I think, is a hypothetical question. I think it would be like trying to put toothpaste back into the tube, to say we should no longer have private security, and we all know that's just impossible. So I think my position has always been that if we have private security, and we have private security actors who are in a position to use force, they're in a position of having physical control over other human beings, then we have to make sure that the regulatory frameworks for these actors is as strong as it possibly can be. And so we've already heard about proper vetting, proper training, proper oversight of these actors. And this is where states are falling down. States really do need to get their act together and make sure that they have proper regulatory frameworks in place. And Daria already talked about this. There seems to be a clear direction that states are heading in, where they are using private security as a way to avoid their own obligations under international human rights law to protect human rights, and thereby not being accountable and not being responsible. But at the same time, because the mechanisms for regulating the private security industry are not strong, then you have a gap. You have a regulatory gap, and so for the victims of human rights abuses, there's a fundamental problem there. How do you ensure accountability? How do you ensure responsibility? And I think this is where organisations like the International Code of Conduct Association have a really important role to play. But at the moment, we have only 7 states that are members of the ICOCA as we know it. So states need to step up, and they need to recognise that they have a responsibility to ensure that private security providers are complying with human rights standards. And when we talk about, and the second thing I think that is important that we need to get across to the industry is that that they are capable of violating human rights in a really broad way. There's still this understanding within the security industry that they only violate certain human rights, and they don't necessarily understand the very broad nature of human rights issues. So, for example, Beatrice was talking about South Africa. We saw in South Africa that private security was being used together with public security services, and they were evicting people from their homes in the pandemic. Now, if you're evicting somebody from their home in a pandemic, you're not only depriving them of their home and impacting on their right to home and family life, but you're also putting them into a position where they might be in breach of curfews. They might not then be able to socially distance. So you're then starting to impact on their right to health, for example. So the industry, I think, really has to get on board with the idea that that different people are impacted in different ways by their activities, and that different rights are impacted broader than, say, so the International Code of Conduct for private security providers, that is, which is what the ICOCA oversees. It mentions sort of half a dozen human rights. It talks about the right to life. It talks about the right to be free from torture. It talks about human trafficking. It talks about child labour. But it doesn't go into these more nuanced understandings of human rights. And I think the code focuses or forces companies to think about human rights in a very narrow way, and I think that's hugely problematic. So in terms of good practices, I would want to see more states stepping up, recognizing their role in protecting human rights. I would want to see the companies themselves recognizing the broad nature of human rights, and I would want the companies to also see how inequalities and intersectionalities, as Daria already mentioned, can result in very severe human rights for particular groups. I would also say something about clients, but Beatrice already mentioned that, and I'm very conscious of time, but I think clients have a really important role to play here, clients other than governments.
Thank you very much. Daria, I see that you seem to want to contribute. Yes, please.
Very, very briefly, I would respond to a controversial question with another controversial answer. So for me, on the basis of the research I do in the context of people on the move, my answer would be not in the way in which I wouldn't want to see private service security services in the way they are deployed at the moment. They're deployed with one idea, and that is that of migration control and of pushbacks and of violations of non-refoulement. So if a state employs security services with that idea in mind, there is of course a problem. There's a problem from the point of view of the states. There is a problem from the point of view of the industry that is providing the service, but is also trying to attract contracts on the basis of their service provision. So it's a very complex system that we're looking at, and it's not a system where nobody is innocent. So what I'm trying to say is that if we want to continue having security services, private security services in the migration context, there has to be a rethink really of how that happens, because legally there are problems of attribution. So you cannot very often attribute the actions of the security contractors to the state, and then there's a gap, as Sorka said. And in terms of good practice, yes, I mean the idea would be, as I said before, to have them integrated in a system that perhaps look at alternative pathways, or perhaps look at way to enhancing access to international protection, because the idea would be of international protection. So I would like to see them deployed for that rather than for pushbacks.
Thank you very much. So this, from what I hear from you is you would put the main responsibility on the state. You would start everything from the state, or would you also?
No, I think that's not the complete picture. What I was trying to say is that the security providers also pitch themselves and their services in the same lens of restriction, in the same lens of at the margin of legalities, and using that borderline of legalities from when a pushback can happen.
Yes.
So I think it's on both sides.
Excellent. And Beatrice, you wanted to say something? I saw you.
Yeah, just a quick word because I think we're running out of time already. I wanted to add, I fully agree with Daria and Sorka I've said, but maybe to add that indeed it's a question of national level regulatory framework, but also a question of how we contribute to create and disseminate best practice or good practice within the sector in terms that would contribute to increase the standards in terms of shield and harm mitigation, or in terms of mitigating and preventing human rights abuses. So I think it should be definitely having an effort at these two different levels. And I would even add to what has been said earlier, is that specifically our conversation is about COVID-19. There should be a much more specific focus, again, on what it is to be trained on being a protector during an outbreak, a large-scale outbreak response or a pandemic. How do you investigate specific instances of uses of excessive force in this context? What type of national legislation is being needed on public health emergencies? Being meaningful that in these circumstances, the security forces, including those who are supporting them, are being tasked with different sorts of functions and roles. So again, I would encourage to look at what are the best practices, how do you build the capabilities of the companies, and maybe that's the conversation we need to have within the ICOCA actually, to make more specific guidance and training modules which are related to public health responses, as well as looking at building the capabilities.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. As everyone mentioned, we are running out of time without surprise. But what would, as final words, what would you say? What can states? You all mentioned some elements to respond to this, but to summarize, what can states, the industry, and clients do to prepare and ensure that private security actors make societies safer instead of exposing populations to adverse human rights impacts in crises such as COVID? So we have 4 minutes, so I'll give 1 minute to each one of you. Please, Storka, if you could start.
States need to understand that if they are going to be using private security providers in a situation like a pandemic, that they need to understand that these providers are being used in new spaces, they're being asked to do new things, there needs to be proper vetting, there needs to be proper training. There were numerous examples of where private security providers were taking medical histories, they were taking temperatures, they have been inappropriate with women in quarantine hotels. It's very, very clear that that there hasn't been adequate training, that there hasn't been adequate vetting, and there isn't adequate oversight, and states need to recognize that, and the industry needs to recognize that. The second thing is that states and industry need to understand that they need to properly pay and look after the workers who are in this industry, because they've been particularly exposed, as I already mentioned, during the pandemic.
Thank you. Daria, would you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, very briefly, as a lawyer, I would give a lawyerly answer. I would want to see contracts that very clearly share the level of responsibility and give access to court and to responsibility for both states and private security for the abuses that they commit.
Thank you so much. And Beatrice, you have the last word.
Yeah, 2 points. To the states, I would say adhere to the ICOCA and support the ICOCA. the number of member states that we have today is not enough, as Sorcia mentioned. And second, actually, my main message would not be to states, would be to companies and to clients, including states, obviously. I think they absolutely need to develop their understanding of the civilian environment and their capacity to engage with local population, civil society, and civilians in this very unstable environment. So it means being a capacity to better anticipate threats, but also better respond and prevent potential incidents of civilian harm.
Excellent, thank you so much. So we have here a big palette of recommendations that we can already offer to governments, to the industry, to clients on how to prepare for a pandemic, so that private security actors actually contribute to protecting us more,